The anterior medial compartment of the forearm is divided into superficial and deep muscles. The superficial muscles include pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor carpi ulnaris. The deep muscles of the anterior medial compartment include flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, and pronator quadratus. The muscles in this compartment are all innervated by the median nerve, with the exception of the flexor carpi ulnaris and the ulnar two heads of the flexor digitorum profundus. If we look at this picture on the bottom, that is a cross section at the wrist. These are obviously the carpals that make up the distal row. We see two muscles, the muscles of the thenar compartment and hypothenar compartment. There is a layer of fascia on the flexor side of the wrist called the flexor retinaculum. The flexor retinaculum goes from the trapezium across to the hook of hamate. That creates what's called the carpal tunnel. This fascia then splits to form a second canal called Guyon's canal. So in the wrist we have the carpal tunnel as well as Guyon's canal. Guyon's canal is between the pisiform and the hook of the hamate. The carpal tunnel contains 10 structures, 9 tendons, and 1 nerve. It contains the 4 tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus, 4 tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis, along with the flexor pollicis longus. It also contains the median nerve. A lesion of the carpal tunnel will create problems in the median nerve distribution within the hand only. Guyon's canal contains the ulnar artery and ulnar nerve. A lesion to Guyon's canal will cause problems in the ulnar nerve pattern within the hand only. Both superficial and deep ulnar nerves will be affected with a lesion of Guyon's canal. On the posterior side of the forearm, we have the posterior lateral compartment. Within the posterior lateral compartment, the muscles are grouped into the superficial lateral group, the superficial posterior group, and the deep posterior lateral group. The posterior compartment of the forearm contains the superficial lateral compartment, the superficial posterior compartment, and the deep posterior lateral compartment. The superficial lateral compartment contains the brachioradialis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, and the extensor carpi radialis brevis. The brachioradialis is a flexor of the elbow and is innervated by the radial nerve. The extensor carpi radialis longus is a weak flexor of the elbow and also extends and radially deviates the wrist. It is innervated by the radial nerve as well. The extensor carpi radialis brevis is a weak flexor of the elbow, as well as an extensor and radially deviator of the wrist. It is innervated by the deep radial nerve. The radial nerve comes down the posterior brachial compartment in the arm, winds around the lateral epicondyle, and as radial innervates the brachioradialis and the extensor carpi radialis longus. It then divides into a superficial radial, which provides sensory information from the back of the thumb and back of the hand, as well as a deep radial that innervates the extensor carpi radialis brevis, as well as the muscles of the superficial posterior and deep posterior lateral compartment. The muscles of the superficial posterior compartment include the extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. The extensor digitorum extends the wrist and extends the fingers through the extensor expansion. The extensor digiti minimi extends the wrist and extends the pinky. And the extensor carpi ulnaris extends and ulnarly deviates the wrist. The extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and extensor carpi ulnaris are all innervated by the deep radial nerve. The muscles of the deep posterior lateral compartment include the extensor pollicis longus, which can participate in wrist extension and thumb extension, extensor pollicis brevis, which is mainly an extensor of the thumb, the abductor pollicis longus, which is an abductor of the thumb, extensor indicis, which extends the index finger, and the supinator muscle. The extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, extensor indicis, the abductor pollicis longus, and the supinator are all innervated by the deep radial nerve. In fact, as the radial nerve splits into superficial radial and deep radial, the deep radial nerve will penetrate through the supinator to go from anterior to the posterior forearm to innervate the extensors. Last, we'll look at the extensor tunnels of the wrist. The first tunnel, that's most radial, is made up of the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. The second tunnel actually exists within the anatomical snuff box. In that tunnel are the tendons of the extensor carpi radialis brevis and the extensor carpi radialis longus. The third tunnel is the tunnel for the extensor pollicis longus. Tunnel number 4 is extensor digitorum and extensor indicis. Tunnel number 5, extensor digiti minimi, and tunnel number 6 is for the extensor carpi ulnaris. I would highly suggest you palpate these tendons and tunnels on your own hands. This will give you the best grasp of the numbers as they are numbered from radial to ulnar. One of the questions you might get asked on the exam is which of the following make up the radial or ulnar borders of the anatomical snuff box. The radial border of the anatomical snuff box is made up of abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. The ulnar border of the anatomical snuff box is made up of the extensor pollicis longus. Injury to the snuff box itself would involve the tendons of the ECRL, or extensor carpi radialis longus, and the ECRB, which is the extensor carpi radialis brevis.